Thank you, David, and thank you to all of the people at BARD who made this happen, and David and Josh for inviting me to participate in this. It's been a wonderful experience, and I will say that this space that we're in right now is without a doubt the most beautiful presentation space that I've ever been in, and so there's much to be said for that. I'm Kathy Kelly. I teach history at the University of Oklahoma. I'm also the editor of the Journal of the Early Republic, and it's my pleasure today to be able to introduce to you our two speakers. I'm going to introduce them in order, and then I'll say a few things to open discussion about their papers. Our first presenter is Erika Piola, who is the Associate Curator of Prints and the Co-Director of Visual Culture, the Visual Culture Program at the Library Company of Philadelphia. Erika holds degrees from Haverford and the University of Pennsylvania, where she received a master's degree in history. She's published widely on 19th-century visual culture, lithography, and print ephemera. She's coming to us most directly today, though, as the project director for an exhibit that's just opened up at the Library Company called Common Touch, The Art of Senses in the History of the Blind. And that is going to be, her work on that exhibit forms the background for her presentation today. Our second speaker is Chris Lukasik, who has a bachelor's and also a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the University of Illinois. He took his doctorate at Johns Hopkins, and he's currently an associate professor of English at Purdue University. He's probably best known to many of you for his first book, Discerning Characters. He's held a wide variety of fellowships to support both that book and the book that he's working on now. The new project, the project which forms the basis of his presentation today, is tentatively titled The Image in the Text, Intermediality, Illustration, and 19th Century American Literature. And so, Erika, voila.
I've just started using readers, so hopefully this will work out for me here. But first, I also wanted to thank Kathy, Josh, and David for getting us all together. I think it's going to be a great day of presentations and papers and talks, so thank you. And also thank you, Laura, for helping with all the logistics and the technical aspects of today. And one just other quick sort of shameless plug, part of my co-directing the visual culture program is also, we have a visual culture fellowship, 1 month fellowship that's offered through the Library Company. So I think this is a good group to mention that too. And the deadline is usually early March, and it's for, like I said, a 1 month fellowship. So I hope some of you might apply, and I know some of you have applied, and I see folks in the audience who have had that fellowship. So, okay. The art of printing is sight for the blind, declared a volunteer at the Boston celebration for the 400th anniversary of printing in 1840. When Jakob Schneider, Jr. printed the first American embossed text in Philadelphia in 1833, it was lauded as, quote, a style of unequal typography for the sightless, end quote. Most people do not consider that this art did not mean Braille. Over a dozen tactile reading systems classified as either alphabetical or arbitrary have been developed in the United States and Europe since the 1780s. Alphabetical systems mimicked Roman letters and on occasion were accompanied by embossed illustrations. The arbitrary systems used dots and symbols to represent letters and parts of words. Advocates for the blind derisively denoted this method with a label synonymous with randomness and autocracy. Before the ascent of Braille, at the end of the Victorian era, raised printing for the blind depicting Roman letters prevailed in the United States. The intransigence of tactile alphabetical reading systems evoked a didactic ethos that privileged the eye over the fingertip. In the United States, two schools for the blind, the New England Asylum for the Blind, later Perkins Institution for the Blind, opened in 1832, and the Pennsylvania Institution for the Instruction of the Blind, instituted in 1833, were at the center of the early movements to produce raised prints for the visually impaired. This raised typography for the blind, a nascent form of touch art, remains under-examined for its significance to the history of reading, printing, and visual culture in the United States. This paper examines 19th century printing for the blind to challenge our presumptions about the relationship between sight, reading, and knowledge within the context that the prints are utilitarian, yet artistic works and their materiality. In recent years, the haptic nature of seeing increasingly makes analytic inroads in visual culture and disability studies. Raised print works intended to be read by both the eye and the fingers expose provocative paradigms about the history of visual culture and the blind. Our literal and figurative understanding of how we perceive the world around us continues to be dominated by the metaphor and aesthetic knowing is seeing. Graphics and sight-connoting verbiage dominate our cultural lexicons. Nonetheless, the human sensorium affects the perception of pictures for those sighted and those who are visually impaired. The physicality of the artifacts of raised printing for the blind serves as a compelling vehicle to explore the reading in the sense of the act of reading as well as the perception of words and images through individuals' multiple senses. I argue that tactile prints document a complicated, dissonant, variegated interrelationship as opposed to a stable, subjugated one between the visual culture of the sighted and the blind. Sorry about that. Valentin Ouy, French linguist, educator, and founder of the first school for the blind, developed the first successful embossing type resembling rounded Roman letters in 1784. The early American educators of the blind Julius Friedlander, founder of the Pennsylvania Institution, and his peer Samuel G. Howe, director of Perkins, employed alphabetical systems, Philadelphia line and Boston line, as the standard for raised print works in their curriculums. Although the men who understood the centrality of reading to their students sought to improve the shape and thus the tactility of the raised letters, they never diverted from the principle that the education of the visually impaired conformed to the manners of the seeing. American line types evolved in a post-Enlightenment visual culture that legitimated, even predetermined this conformation to manners of the seeing. 19th-century blind individuals lived, read, and learned in a society ultimately governed by scopic regimes privileging sight. The raised text epitomized the complexities of W.J.T. Mitchell's dialectical trope of the fluid ideological borders between word and image. For the visually impaired, like the sighted, as Mitchell argues, the social construction of the visual field and the visual construction of the social field informs the individual's aesthetic and cognitive world. Indoctrinated in this legitimated, visually centric culture, Friedlander stridently expounded to his potential donors, soon after the Pennsylvania Institution opened in 1833, quote, "The basis of a scientific cultivation of the mind is knowledge of our vernacular language. Therefore, if we have grammars in the tangible characters for the use of the blind, written in the same manner as if intended for those who can see, will he not be able to communicate not only to his brethren, but even to those blessed with sight?" End quote. For Friedlander, as for Howe, a system of tangible, that is, Roman letters, also readable by the eyes of the sighted, the presumed teachers of the systems provided the means. The Victorian sociopolitical concepts of disability compounded this cultural dictate of assimilation. One had to read and learn and by circumstance act as sighted to communicate with those blessed with sight. To be given the rights of the able-bodied, the blind had to pass through haptic vision. The pedagogical philosophy of Friedlander and Howe that affected the relief in line type as ensuring haptic vision started during a period in the visual literacy of 19th century society that can be referred to as a pictorial turn. Images read as superseding words to promote, persuade, and dominate rhetoric. The evolution occurred in tangent with several improvements to typography and the printing of graphics, including the mimetic implications of photography and an explosion in color printing during the mid-century. It was an era of seemingly non-stop technological innovations that cultivated a mass visual culture. The perfecting of the ability to produce images, grounded in the modern market ethic that because one is able to produce in great quantities, one should, fed Victorians' need and expectancy to see pictorial works every day. Within this turn, Jakob Schneider, a mechanical engineer by trade and recording secretary of the Pennsylvania Institution, served in 1833 as the school and nation's first successful printer for the blind. Institution administrators hailed his raised print letter text, The Gospel According to St. Mark, as noted. The popular press did as well. Both communities continued to advocate for line systems for over the next 4 decades. Through the late 1860s, different line systems developed, particularly in association with the Pennsylvania Institution. Schneider's system evolved by the late 1830s into Philadelphia line, with all capital Roman letters, and then by about 1867 matured into combined letter, which is composed of capitals and a version of the angular lowercase letters of Boston line. By mid-century, all raised print texts, predominantly reprints of biblical and popular moral works, were didactic commodities because of their production costs. Still, a number of textbooks, like Howe's adaptation of Denison Olmsted's Rudiments of Natural Philosophy, published in Boston Line in 1845, contained embossed illustrations, maps, and diagrams. A decade before the publication of the embossed printed Olmsted, a newspaper columnist publicly heralded printing for the blind. The author acknowledged its preeminent role among the several new printing technologies affecting the visual culture of the period in his humbly titled 1835 article, Printing for the Blind. He espoused, quote, "The past year has produced another invention connected with the art of printing that will be hailed with gratitude by thousands of the present and future generations. Hitherto, the beauties and benefits could be appreciated by those who are only favored with sight. Now even the blind can enjoy the pleasure of reading. Gospel of St. Mark is a fine illustration of the prophecy that the blind shall see. This interesting invention and the discovery of lithography are greater in extent than all the previous improvements connected with the art, and the future historian will have occasion to dwell upon the present age as an important era in the history of printing." End quote. In 1840, an article about a Cambridge University-bound Perkins student circulated widely in the popular press. The column praised the student as an epitome of the cultural revolution effected by printing for the blind. The year was also the 400th anniversary of the art of printing. The anniversary caused celebrations in major printing centers in the country, including Boston and Philadelphia. At the Boston celebration, a volunteer at the fete declared, "The 1835 prophecy is fulfilled by toasting the art of printing as sight to the blind." This quite short but weighty affirmation formed the heart of the unwavering insistence of the teaching of line types. Paternalistic assimilation of the blind into the perceptual social sphere of the sighted served as a primary motive, but also a romanticized prescient concept of feeling seeing. If those who are blind read the same letters as the sighted, they would experience the same existential aesthetics as them. The rationale is more than just assimilation, but a culturally contrived conception of the printing serving as a way for the blind to see, that is, perceive, know, the world as if a sighted person. During this critical juncture in the romanticization of line printing for the blind, Victorian psycho and physiological philosophies infused popular conceptions of vision and knowledge. In 1833, when Gospel of St. Mark was published, it was the same year as the publication of the first American edition of the Treatise of Optics, authored by British philosopher David Brewster. Brewster, an advocate of an optical philosophy that theorized the eye as the primary organ of knowledge, wrote prolifically on the subject of the role of vision in the hierarchy of the senses in learning. Between the 1830s and 1850s, he and his primary rival, Charles Wheatstone, debated about this role, particularly with respect to binocularity, three-dimensional stereoscopy, and feeling seeing. The arguments, informed by 18th century theories of vision as a learned language, affected popular general conceptions of sight and learning that continue to have relevancy. While Brewster supported the Newtonian philosophy of knowing is seeing, Wheatstone championed the empiricist philosophy of the experiential nature of touch and sight as our mediated means to insight. A concept of binocular vision embodying a haptic dimension became commonly accepted. Roland Barthes' denotative and connotative theory of the rhetoric of images adds further depth to this historical construct of feeling seeing, when made synonymous with seeing feeling for the blind through popular conventions. With the raised printing placed in the context of a visually constructed code, conflated with the haptic, we can then conjecture for Victorians, sighted and visually impaired, learning to see in new ways through new technologies, that the line systems denoted and connoted the alphabet and sight for the blind, respectively. At the outset of these antebellum debates about binocular vision and knowledge, both aesthetic and cognitive, Howe, the developer of Boston Line, could not resist in 1833 in describing raised text in terms of a visual analysis, albeit a criticism of art. Quote, "The books printed by the blind have attracted much attention and excited much observation, but we cannot perceive that they are in any respect superior to those issued from the press in the very infancy of the art. It is a beautiful and most valuable invention which enables the blind to look along the pages of a book." End quote. Almost 40 years later, with support for dot systems growing, longtime Pennsylvania institution principal William Chapin echoed Howe's feelings of the beauty of raised type as works of art for the eyes, when in the 1873 annual report he noted, quote, "The Philadelphia print has the great merits of being easily read by seeing and blind, and of even greater beauty." End quote. The beauty of the prints referred to by both Howe and Chapin originates from the aesthetics of the tactile works that privileged the eye in reading the text, the embossed Roman letters, into images. Angles and lighting transform cameos and embossments into intriguing ghosts of letters for the sighted, exposing the perceptual limits of vision, and then evoke a need to touch to understand what they are misreading with their eye. Fingertips also misread the embossed letters. Although the visual culture of the period fostered the concept of raised printing as sight for the visually impaired, the alphabetical system so ardently advocated in the mid-19th century proved efficient for vicarious reading as an active reading practice. Blind educator William H. Levy's experience proved more common than that of the Perkins student mentioned earlier. In his 1872 treatise, Blindness in the Blind, he wrote, "The characteristics of a letter are often to be found in its interior. The difficulty experienced in reading, even by those with very acute touch, can scarcely be imagined." Reading in all connotations is ultimately a subjective act, and historically usually only associated with the visual. As suggested by historian of reading Roger Chartier, the already established audience of a print should not delimit its potential. By virtue, prints evoke their user and not the opposite. What the 19th century cited saw and physically and emotionally felt about the art of line type affected how they understood it and how it was received by those blind students who felt and read it in both senses of the word. The disability aesthetic scholar Tobin Siebers examined this subjective bodily act of reading words into visible things. He suggested these images are the disabled soldiers to words in the literary war between word and image. To describe a picture with words does not typically cause consternation, but to picture a word as an image provokes qualifications. He expands on this conception of reading words embodied as images, empowered by detail, with the metaphor that disability is invisible until it becomes visible. He argues for it as a pivot point to value disability for the human imagination. I want to redirect his point and use an artifact of the disability of blindness with words with literal materiality, the raised printing, in the context of a vivid, not visual analysis of words. When this analysis does not privilege the eye and the human imagination, what can we conjecture as we travel down this possible rabbit hole of mine? What if the word is a picture for the sighted, and the picture is a word for the blind? For the blind during the 19th century, they are touching/reading a dual text image into a mental picture influenced by the visual culture of their era. As a tactile teaching tool in art, the raised prints document the complicated implications and conflations to be unpacked about the physical act of feeling, seeing, or in the historical terms, the cultural propaganda of the line types, feeling beauty. A possible way to start to put the conflation of emotional and physical feeling of the sighted and the blind into a further context with the historical trajectory is to examine raised types in terms of font psychology. Font psychology engenders a concept of a universal, commonplace sensory experience to feel what you see and see what you feel. Although focused on typography used in advertising to influence consumerism, and a relatively recent analytic, font psychology can also be judiciously applied to the raised printing, particularly in terms of the work's aesthetics, which were used as propaganda by its 19th century advocates during a pictorial turn in the visual literacy of 19th century society. Line types were designed as a sans serif font. The letters are devoid of small lines at the end of characters. Developed in the early 1800s, devisers and readers of sans serif denoted it to be a font of clarity and legibility and easy to read. In advertising displays of the early 19th century, words in all sans serif capital letters were considered particularly effective in inducing this feeling in their viewers. Creators of sans serif line types for the blind infused this bias psychology into its development. The lack of serifs, in addition to capitals, would facilitate clarity of touch and perception for the finger reader, similar to the clarity psychologically felt by the sighted of such font. When Victorian sighted beholders denote this alphabet construct as art, then a scholar, Gina Klieg, who has low vision and is studying the visual culture of the blind, has observed, it becomes subject to the conventions, vocabulary, idioms, and syntax of its period and generation of art, and so understanding it as art involves some degree of decoding or translating visual elements into words. I propose we complicate Victorian's denotation of printing for the blind as art by placing Klieg's observation within the context of Barth's myth element of the connotative meaning of images appearing denotative, that is, literal and natural. We can then detect a further justification for their unwavering advocacy of line systems. During the 19th century, the mythical denotative precepts of the visual culture of the period promulgated an expectation of a parallel translation by the visually impaired of the art of line systems, a raised image text alphabet. In the decoding of this art via feeling, seeing, seeing, feeling, the blind would decode the tangible word elements into visual elements, mental representations to see and read the Roman letters as Roman letters to understand them and appreciate their beauty. By contrast, for the sighted, arbitrary systems of dots like Braille represented an ugly, illegible non-alphabet. Its readers cannot empathize with nor admire the image evoked by the familiar, correct typography of Roman letters. The conflation of emotional and physical feeling for the beauty of sans serif font discredited the tactile learning possibility of dot systems, aesthetically an imperceptible image text code. The visual culture of the period did, however, dictate other non-word images as correctly perceptible by the blind, and pictorial details imbued the line and combined letterworks. Though ultimately representative of 19th century ableist visual culture ethics, Inclusion of tactile illustrations and raised text should not be dismissed as just iterations of systemic prejudices in the era's visual culture. Contemporary research on tactile communication suggests that specific attributes can be captured of an original visual artifact when made tactile that represent some aspects of its origin. 19th century advocates of alphabetical systems motives may be suspect, but the end result's less so. In Printing for the Blind, the treatment of title pages epitomizes this capturing of representations of some aspects of an original form, its aura. Embossed marquee-like frames and ornaments around titles often appeared on the raised print title pages of the text. The seemingly unnecessary adornments epitomized an era of requisite illustration of the mundane with even the minutest of pictorial details. Printers strove to keep the reader aesthetically engaged through contrasting elements via the eye, or in the case of the tactile volumes, the fingertip. A demonstration of the artistry of the printer, the sincere measure immersed the blind reader in the popular visual culture of the day. In other instances, printers customized illustrations, originally ink printed into a tactile form. The Perkins Institution's adaptation of Rudiments of Natural Philosophy readily lent itself to such a presentation. As often happened with different publishers' mass reproduction of the same image in reprinted ink text and as separately issued graphics, the printer's transfer process reversed the illustrations from their original orientation. This occurred with these embossed figures, Figure 12 and Figure 13. The reversal represents an idiosyncratic equality in the reading of graphics by the eye and/or fingertip. Furthermore, in the circumstance of illustration, Figure 13, demonstration of the center of gravity, the raised illustration is actually more accurate to its discursive description. A larger embossed circle represents the larger described ball B than the ink-printed one in the original image. The printer practically provides the finger reader, not the sighted reader, with the more accurate picture of Olmsted's model of gravity. For the Victorian blind reader, raised print text in line and with embossed illustrations embodied standard graphic and typographic design principles. The aesthetic hierarchy engaged with in the organization of textual and graphic elements during the act of reading, in uncomplicated terms, parallels the hierarchy of senses privileging vision. And yet such engagement did not consistently relegate the finger reader of images and text to the subordinate other. Despite this sensory hegemony, the popular philosophies informing 19th century visual culture ultimately, albeit latently, advocated the beauty of disability. Printing for the Blind reflected the Victorian cultural empirical tenets that interchanged feeling-seeing into seeing-feeling in the mirror of the disability of blindness. By advocating the beauty of a shadow typography, sighted educators recognized the virtue of the limitations of the eye, susceptible to illusions and other visual misinformation. This alternate visual grammar inadvertently exposed the limitations of vision when popular commentaries celebrated a learnable kinesthetic language as equal to sight. Although the haptic experience of seeing these utilitarian pieces of art through touching Roman letters ultimately proved efficient for reading as an act, perhaps as a vicarious visual experience for the blind, it proved more effective for reading to see, that is to know as in perceive and understand the visual culture of the Victorian period. Thank you.
All right, I'd like to thank David and Josh and Kathy for inviting me here to participate in this symposium, and to thank all of you for allowing me to share my work with you. This is work in progress, so it's new, and I'll get started. Let me start by offering an apology. Not mine, of course, but one made by Stephen H. Gimber over 185 years ago in the October 15th, 1830 issue of the Euterpiad. Undoubtedly encouraged by the journal's publisher, Gimber apologized to readers for failing to provide an engraving for the current issue. After exonerating the publisher from any blame, he closes with words familiar to many a 19th century periodical editor. The print will most positively appear in the next number. Gimber was likely feeling the heat of editor George W. Blinkner, who just announced in the previous issue that the Euterpiad would be undergoing a dramatic makeover, Its pages would feature more fine arts and polite literature, Bleeckner boasted, and an engraving by Gimber would soon appear in the next number. Yet when the new series launched 2 weeks later, readers looking for Gimber's engraving found his apology instead. While this kind of engraver shaming was not uncommon during the period, editors routinely complained about the chronic procrastination of their engravers or the delinquency of their engravings. What makes Gimber's apology unusual is that he is not only identified by name, but has apparently placed the notice himself or has been, let's say, encouraged to do so. Besides confirming our understanding of just how important engravings were becoming to the circulation of literary print culture in the 1830s America, this singularity affirms just how damaging their absence might be. True to his word, Gimber and his engraving, he produced it. This is an illustration, Gimber's engraving, an illustration from Ovid's Metamorphoses, eventually did appear in the next issue of the Euterpiad. Bleeckner, however, was rather terse with his notice. After identifying the image as Apollo entrancing the shepherds by the melody of his lyre, he huffed that it was useless to enter into a minute description of it, because Ovid's story is so well known. Perhaps Bleeckner's silence was payback for the absence of the engraving in the previous issue. After all, Bleeckner had been telling subscribers since September that they would be receiving an engraving that would be superior to anything of the kind that ever appeared in this country and at a cost of $100 to the proprietors. Or perhaps the engraving arrived too late for Bleeckner to compose a proper description for it. Or perhaps Bleeckner was upset that what Gimber finally gave him was well known in the sense that it was copied from a familiar print source. However well known Ovid's story or Gimber's design was, the engraving proved valuable enough for at least one reader to remove it so that it might embellish an 1839 sewing box rather than the ephemeral pages of the Euterpiad. We know that engravings were used to market a variety of mid-19th century print media. In fact, images such as Gimber's engraving, as Catherine Martinez suggests with respect to literary annuals, may have been the primary reason subscribers bought the Euterpiad's miscellany of literature, musical scores, and news in the first place. Yet what interests me here is how this engraving, a literary illustration no less, at once matters and doesn't matter to the Euterpiad. It matters insofar as its absence sets off a sequence of editorial apology and reluctant acknowledgement designed to placate anxious subscribers and publishers, as the journal tried to reimagine itself and expand its readership in a competitive print cultural marketplace. It doesn't matter insofar as the engraving doesn't illustrate any particular text found in the Euterpiad, and in fact the miscellany bears little relationship to it, other than being its habitat, as it were. In this sense, differing little from the material artifact that one copy of Gimber's engraving would eventually call home. Indeed, its migration to the interior of an 1839 sewing box suggests that the legibility of Gimber's engraving as an illustration of Ovid, that is, as a visual representation of a particular moment in a specific literary text, perhaps matters less than the transmission of its visibility of an image of fine art based on classical literature. I start with Gimber's engraving, with its multiple forms of intermediality and complicated relationship to literature, both as a representation of it and as a vehicle for selling it, not only because it underscores the growing importance of images of fine art to the circulation of literary print culture, but because it discloses how the relationship between image and text during the 1830s could be both disjunctive and symbiotic at the same time. The relationship was disjunctive in the sense that many images were separate, physically and often conceptually, from the text they accompanied. And yet the relationship was also symbiotic in the sense that emergent mass print cultural forms, such as literary annuals, periodicals, and newspapers, depended upon such images to attract readers, while at the same time, those images used those print cultural forms as an environment in which to be seen and move. While the movement of Gimber's image from journal to sewing box was a literal journey, the way in which its presence matters and doesn't matter to the Euterpiad should prompt us to reconsider how print culture, specifically literature, might have mediated the circulation of such optical images and vice versa. To do so, I believe, is to gain a better understanding of the relationship between images and text at a critical moment in their continued evolution into an emergent mass visual culture. In what follows, I want to discuss the movement of one such image, an 1833 oil painting by the British artist Robert William Buss entitled Soliciting a Vote, across and within a variety of optical and print media, particularly literary annuals during the 1830s and 40s. Later engraved on both sides of the Atlantic, Buss's image would serve as the source for one of the more popular prints of the 19th century, and it would appear no less than 7 times in American literary annuals, periodicals, and imprints. Yet what makes Buss's Hogarthian painting on politics so remarkable is not simply its transmediality, the same image moving across different optical and print media, but the role of literature in facilitating that movement. While the reprinting of the same engraving is consistent with the 19th century practice of reused plates and periodical and literary annual publishing, I want to examine how the text illustrating the engraved image might have served to or recontextualize the optical image so as to minimize the recognition of its reuse while simultaneously substantiating its claims to retain continued value as an example, or to use a common term from the period, a specimen of fine art. For this reason, I am less interested in interpreting what either the image, the text, or their media combination meant. I'm not going to say a word about it. Although its pictorial and textual meanings undoubtedly played an important role in its movement. I'm less interested in that than I am in trying to understand how those meanings might have been secondary to the engraving status as a widely circulating image of fine art. If engravings were becoming increasingly vital to the circulation of print culture during the middle of the 19th century, as the example of Gimber's engraving suggests, then what I would like to do today is to explore how the various textual illustrations accompanying Buss's image might have worked to preserve the cultural capital of his painting, despite its downward distribution as an engraved image circulating within an emergent mass visual culture. To do so, I believe, is to rethink literature's relationship to images at a crucial point in the development of a mass print culture. At this point, you might be forgiven for slowly raising your hand and politely asking, who is Robert William Buss? That the creator of such memorable art historical titles, such as his 1829 A Hearty Squeeze, or his 1831 The Stingy Traveler that you see here, should remain shrouded in obscurity is an oversight I seek to remedy. Although little discussed today, Buss's 1833 Soliciting a Vote was one of the more popular images in the 19th century Atlantic world. The oil painting first appeared at the British Institution exhibition in 1833 in London, where it was immediately met with praise by the press. The painting was soon engraved by Thomas Gough Lupton in 1834 under the title Soliciting a Vote, and its prints, as London's The People's Journal would later recall, were soon found in all the print shops. The image would eventually prove to be so popular that it would be pirated, mass manufactured on pocket handkerchiefs, and as is sadly the case with so many pirated handkerchief images these days, they would become the subject of a lawsuit. Although Buss himself may have been unfamiliar to most 19th century Americans, his image most certainly was not. Upon his death in 1875, New York City's Independent noted that while Buss's name has not often been heard on this side of the Atlantic, one of his productions, Soliciting a Vote, must be very familiar from its frequent reproductions in the various illustrated works. Indeed, Buss's painting would be reproduced as an engraving no fewer than a half dozen times in the United States between 1835 and 1845. To the best of my knowledge, Edward Carey and Abraham Hart were the first to do so, having hired George Brown Ellis to engrave Buss's painting, or more likely Lupton's mezzotint of it, for their upcoming inaugural issue of The Gift. In the fall of 1835, they included Ellis's engraving as part of a promotional specimen sheet that was sent to periodicals and newspapers up and down the Atlantic seaboard and as far west as Cincinnati. Since only 3 of the annual's promised 9 engravings were featured on the specimen sheet, Soliciting a Vote received additional publicity, and American reviewers frequently singled it out for praise. When the engraving finally made its debut within the pages of the gift, it was accompanied by a brief textual illustration, presumably written by the Literary Annual's editor, Eliza Leslie. Sharing the same title as the engraving, Leslie's description speaks of the image as if it were Buss's original painting. She explains how the artist has intended the picture as an illustration of the effects of the march of the intellect on the British commonality. Leslie's use of the word illustration here is interesting in the sense of optically picturing a particular text. Leslie's use of the word illustration here is interesting because it means example. Ellis's engraving, in other words, is not an illustration in the sense of optically picturing a particular text found within the Literary Annual. In fact, it doesn't illustrate any text at all in this way, but rather it is a facsimile of Buss's painting, and in this sense, Ellis's engraving serves as an example in a second way, as an example of fine art. Time prevents me from substantiating fully what I'm about to say here, but this sense of illustration as example is consistent with the meaning of the word illustration as it appears within the titles of American periodicals through 1825. In that periodical literature, the meaning of the word illustration as an example is the prevailing one, but it is usually associated with textual descriptions, not optical ones. When the word illustration does refer to an optical image, which is far less frequently, it typically means facsimile or copy. What is worth noting about the media combination of Leslie's text and Ellis's engraving, comprising Soliciting a Vote in the gift, is how it trades in both of these senses of the word illustration, as an example and as a copy. In fact, Leslie's description suggests that Ellis's engraving is valuable despite being a copy, precisely because its status as a facsimile was understood to be exemplary of fine art. This understanding is also amplified by how Leslie's textual illustration literally frames our reception of Buss's heavily mediated image. Her words position Ellis's engraving in the same way that the material culture aspects of the Literary Annual do. They contribute to framing his image as an example of fine art, one that has been separately printed and bound within its print cultural habitat. The inclusion of a tissue guard, which is intended to physically prevent offsetting, further separates image from text and serves to enhance the former's perceived value in a manner similar to how tissue paper works today in a gift bag. We dig through the ephemeral to arrive at the durable, at the gift. The combination of material and textual elements here work to mitigate the status of the engraving as a copy in favor of its status as an original example of fine art. The lavish binding and expensive embellishments featured within the gift marked a strategic departure for Carey and Hart, since the firm was known up until this point for its inexpensive reprints and medical texts. Although we don't know what led Carey and Hart to enter into the more expensive, higher-end gift book market during the mid-1830s, we do know, thanks to the work of Stephanie Height, that it was common for them to offset the cost of an engraving by reusing the image in other later publications. This was unquestionably the case with Soliciting a Vote, which appeared 2 years later in their annual The Literary Souvenir. Although the optical image remains the same, its textual framing has changed entirely. Ellis's engraving has been retitled Canvassing and is now accompanied by a dreadful 4-stanza poem of the same name by Charles West Thompson. Whatever literary merit Thompson's poem possesses, it seems evident that its primary function is to direct our attention to Ellis's engraving and textually illustrate it. It is, in some ways, a literary tissue guard. Yet, in the process of performing this function, Thompson's textual illustration also abandons any attempt at ekphrasis or even pictorialism in favor to what amounts to an audio transcript of Buss's image. Thompson's verse no longer participates in the visualization of an image in the minds of its readers, but passively defers that task to the engraving beside it. The media combination is one in which we see literature yielding the project of image production entirely to the optical media beside it. I'm going to speak more to this in a second. This same media combination of Thompson poem and Ellis engraving would again be featured in Julius A. Noble's 1839 annual The Garland, as the image left Philadelphia behind for a Boston audience. The following year, Buss's image would migrate once more, this time escaping the genre of the literary annual to serve somewhat inexplicably as the frontispiece for a reprinting of Berkhan's Child's Own Storybook, published in Boston by Johnson and Company. While I've been unable to examine a physical or digital copy of this particular imprint, it is difficult to imagine the image's connection to the original 1793 text as being anything other than promotional, perhaps even accidental. Time prevents me from discussing in detail all of the print cultural environments in which Buss's image resided. It would, for example, turn up in the New Hampshire literary magazine, the Iris and Literary Repository in 1842, and 3 years later, it would launch the inaugural issue of the Ladies' Album. But I want to close by briefly discussing the appearance of Buss's image in the Ladies' Album, because it epitomizes this disjunctive and symbiotic nature of these image-text relationships that I described earlier. By 1845, Buss's image had been reprinted so often that the editors of the Ladies' Album could no longer deny its ubiquity. In the textual illustration that accompanied Buss's image, entitled Canvassing, or the Engraving Illustrated, the editors confess that while the steel engraving in this number may not be new to some of our patrons, it can be looked at again without harm. In fact, the editors, in words that should sound familiar to us, apologized to the readers for having to reprint Buss's image yet again, explaining that, quote, it was the best we could get a hold of in the emergency in which we were unhappily involved. We were expecting an original engraving, which we had ordered, and which we waited for as long as we dared to get out our edition before the March expired. While it is tempting to think that Stephen Gimber is once again to blame, or perhaps that one of his fellow equally delinquent Boston engravers is responsible for the editorial emergency of the Ladies' Album, it is far more likely that the editors are simply trying to cover up the fact that they had failed to secure the $100 or more needed to obtain an original engraving for their new magazine. Started in April of 1845 as the supposed continuation of its predecessor periodical, The Ladies' Wreath, the Ladies' Album was in fact launched by the former agents of The Ladies' Wreath as its rival. The editors not only stole the layout and appearance of The Ladies' Wreath, they went so far as to send its subscribers their magazine instead. So it should hardly be surprising to learn that they also claim to have no idea of the engraving's history. I'm quoting now. When, where, or by whom it was designed, they plead, we are left to conjecture. Despite their protestations, as well as the magazine's machinations, the textual illustration that accompanies Buss's image performs much of the same work that Eliza Leslie's description did in The Gift. In fact, it attempts to downplay its reprinting to the journal's patrons, even as it acknowledges its familiarity. As was the case with the Euterpiad, we see the editors of literary print culture in a state of emergency, apologizing as their words lay prostrate before the optical images at their side. If nothing else, I hope my remarks this morning invite us to address the complex ways in which images not only moved across and within a variety of print and optical media, but to consider the ways in which the very idea of an image shifted as a result of these media combinations. Variously understood within this period's literature as something between the verbal, the imaginative, and the optical, the image would eventually be transformed from the imaginative to the optical over the course of the 19th century. As a number of scholars have suggested, the wildly popular genre of the literary annual propelled the growth of illustration during the second quarter of the 19th century. And I would argue it contributed to the transformation of the image during this period. The textual illustrations that would often accompany these steel plate engravings within literary annuals, as I hope the examples of Buss's image in The Gift, the literary souvenir, and the garland suggest, clearly contributed to a transformation in our understanding of what an illustration was and what it might do. Thank you.
As David remarked when he opened our symposium this morning, this event, the papers that we're going to be hearing today, are all aimed at rethinking and reframing our understanding of the relationship between visual and material cultures. Erika Piola and Chris Lukasik get at that by introducing a third element, and that third element, textuality, is what strikes me as being remarkably fresh, especially in this particular context. To be sure, scholars have thought about text and material culture or text and visual culture in the past. That isn't new per se. If we want to think about text and material culture, we might think, for example, of the literature that's come out around the American Antiquarian Society, the history of the book that looks at the production, the distribution, the marketing of different forms of print culture, different kinds of text. Or we might consider as well the sort of material text group at the University of Pennsylvania, which is both a book series contained within Penn Press, but which is also a running symposium. And that group of people looks at, considers text mostly as material objects, but doesn't focus so much on text as objects in conversation with other sorts of objects, other kinds of things. When we think about text and visual culture together, what we see there, mostly historically, is a sharp opposition between the textual and the visual. And that sense of an opposition, of an antithetical relationship, runs all the way from somebody like Barbara Maria Stafford to Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who see these forms as evidence as oppositional and always at odds. And so, while there are many things to like about the two papers that you've just heard, either taken separately or taken together, this is what I want to direct our attention to. The way that they mobilize visuality and materiality and textuality in dynamic ways. The ways that they work at a kind of a triangulation between those three analytic categories, showing how and where these things, the textual, the visual, and the material, intersect. And just important, showing us how those intersections evolve over time, how those intersections and the meanings that they create shift with context, shift with positionality. The value of this project, and I'm thinking about this project as encompassing both Chris and Erika, extends beyond those of us in this room, those of us with investments in visual and material culture. It extends to literary scholars, to social historians, to people with an investment in the history of reading, to people with an investment in the affective and aesthetic dimensions of everyday life. If we think about where these two papers depart from the ways that many people conceptualize these things together, it helps from my perspective to think about it by way of analogy. The older literature, the older work that I've referred to, might be imagined, if we think about it in dance terms, as a sort of a stately line dance, the kind of 18th century phenomenon that shows up in every film remake of every novel that Jane Austen ever wrote. In contrast, what Erika and Chris have given us today looks more like a scene out of Twyla Tharp's When Push Comes to Shove. It's all pivot points, leaps, and sly wit. It's a world of imaginative and intellectual play. And so, for Erika, for example, she's using incredibly novel sources that are unfamiliar, I think, to most people, except those of, perhaps of you, not me, who are specifically interested in the history of blindness, of disability studies. In her hands, the raised print that is devised to help the blind to see, and to help them to see in ways that that privileged sight in the way, and privileged reading in the ways that sighted people use it. That raised text turns out to be better suited, perhaps, for teaching this people who have sight about the limits of their vision. And what about the blind? What do they get from those books? Those books turn words into images, and the books themselves perhaps become vehicles for delivering an intense sensory aesthetic pleasure. Chris Lukasik begins with something that is instantly familiar to anyone who has ever looked at any gift book, either in an archive, an antique, or junk shop, or perhaps on eBay. Illustrations which he says do and do not matter to the texts themselves. And in tracing the transmediality of one kind of awful print, he shows us how unstable the connections between images and text were, and how that instability was conditioned both by the material conditions of production. Editors have to get prints, they've got to corral resources, but also by readers' savvy, or by publishers' projection of those readers' savvy in terms of understanding those images. Precisely because these papers are so rich and so creative, they point to questions. I know that all of you will have plenty of them, but I want to use my platform here to throw out a couple. The more that I think about Chris's paper, the more I think about chronology, and the more I think about it as a problem in chronology. He situates the images that do and do not matter in his literary annuals as a starting place, as a kind of a pivot point, leading to and directing our attention to the inexorable rise of a mass visual culture. Chris is looking down the end of the long 19th century with an eye toward the 20th. But what if we reposition those gift books with an eye toward the rump end of the 18th century? What if we see them not as a starting point? I mean, I understand that the gift books emerged in the 1830s, but they play on and play off of and emerge out of different kinds of print and visual cultures. What, in other words, is the backstory? And if we think about that backstory, it seems to me there are a couple of questions. When and exactly, and why, and how does a copy come to become some sort of secondary form of art, a mere imitation that has to be rescued by dodges like facsimile, illustration, and specimen? As Hunt Howells recently pointed out in his book Against Self-Reliance, there's a long tradition of art and literature in the United States that values emulation, that values copy as copy for the sake of copying, with all of the psychological dynamics and all of the aesthetics that implies. And so you're clearly seeing a point where the copy is a lesser, but how does that emerge and why? In terms of the sort of text and the relationship that Chris directs us to, thinking about the texts that frame, the texts that illustrate the images, those texts, at least the one by Eliza Leslie, look exactly to me like the ones, like the newspaper advertisements from earlier in this century for exhibitionary paintings, where every detail of the painting, every detail of even a museum exhibition is described as, in a way that's always struck me as being didactic, teaching readers how to see what they'll see when they enter into the place. I wanted to know more about how these earlier forms of textuality and visuality shape what it is we saw in the gift books. Erika, it seemed to me, was far less concerned with chronology in her paper. Never mind that her archive is planted squarely in that interregnum between the moment where are very few resources, or perhaps no resources for the blind, and the moment when Braille becomes ascendant. She's less interested, I think, in change over time than in thinking through the multiple experiences that these raised texts enabled, the multiple discussions about the nature of sight, the multiple discussions about the value of seeing that they provided. In order to understand how raised text did and did not work for the visually impaired, in order to understand how raised text did and did not perform cultural work for the sighted, Erika draws on an ambitious swath of theory. We hear from W.J.T. Mitchell and Chartier, and we learn about font psychology, which I didn't even know was a thing until today. And yet, as rich as I found the paper, what I found myself wondering about and wanting as I read and as I thought about the paper was a deeper engagement with the materiality. I wanted to know more about the weight of that paper. I wanted to know how the books were bound. I wanted to know what the weight of a book with raised print felt like on the lap of the blind man who was reading with his fingers compared to the kinds of books that sighted people read. I wondered about reception. These raised texts are being read in a period where reading, the kind of reading that sighted people perform, is invested with an affective importance in a whole series of affective dimensions, psychological development. It's super saturated with meaning. Does that kind of meaning transfer to blind people who read with their fingers? And then I wondered too about how the blind actually experienced reading with these books. How perverse is it to want to have? How perverse is it to wonder about what a period eye for the blind would look like? And that seems to me to be sort of what the paper gets at. But I really wanted more of a period eye. I wanted to hear more about that. I know that you will all have questions for Erika and Chris. I'm incredibly grateful that I had the chance to read these fine papers in advance of this meeting, and I look forward to our discussion of them. Thank you. You can sit behind our name tags. So we have the text, and we have the image right here. Yes. Yes.
I'll start off. Chris, you're all wrong about the bus. It's a beautiful work of art. I think it'll look for
I didn't say it was.
Love the poem. I was really glad that you brought it back to the 18th century because I can't help sitting and listening from my perspective as a historian of 18th century European things. And I was really excited by your emphasis on the shifting meanings of the term and the concept of illustration. And I think it might be productive to do, in a sense, what she's suggesting and look back at that longer history of what that word meant even on the other side of the Atlantic. Your paper made me think that there was a kind of unnoticed shift that maybe starts in the 17th century with works, things that came to mind like Athanasius Kircher's China Illustrata, which has both visual and textual illustrations, but I'm pretty sure that he meant it in the textual sense, but then the necessity of adding some illustrations was one of those stages that shifted the reception of that word. Or even the idea of a gift book. I was thinking like of one of the greatest gift books of the 18th century, which was the Antiquità di Ercolano Esposte, which doesn't use the word illustrated, but exposed, meaning exposited upon. And again, it's one that has both text and illustrations that comment, and text comments on the quality of illustration as a reproduction. So there might be a really rich field to go back and think about the prehistory of those problems.
Yeah, no, thank you, and Kathy, thank you too, because it's something I've been thinking about, and I was struck when I started just digging through. But what I did is I went through sort of through a couple of digital archives, the American Periodical Series and the American Antiquarians Society's historical collection of periodicals, and I just did a document title search for illustration in the title, and then with engraving anywhere else in the text. And what I found, especially in the APS series, and it's by no means exhaustive. It was just, it's sort of a sample basis so far, but I want to kind of follow through on it, was that, the overwhelming majority of instances in these particular archives, illustration was being principally referring to a text, and then the meaning was, typically in the American context at least, an illustration of charity from, such and such biblical passage. So it was always in the sense of example, very infrequently tied to like our sense of illustration, right, meaning some kind of image-text combination. So this started getting me thinking about precisely this question of when and how, right, did this sort of shift in the meaning of this word occur. Now, it's such a frequently used term, to do that kind of like detailed, there were just far too many hits. I narrowed it down to this period between 1800 and 1825, largely because in particular in periodicals, because optical images were infrequently enough attached, so I thought I could get a good sense of whether, are they appearing alongside engravings or not? And the answer to that so far is no, illustration was not meaning that in that sense. Often it was they would talk about the engraving as its own thing, as a facsimile or a sample of this or a specimen of that, whether or not to refer to fine art.
I had some of the same realization with the word monument being used, and I had a hard time understanding what they meant in the early 18th century when they meant a text as a monument, and by the late 18th century they meant what we mean, which is a physical thing to illustrate or make a point. So I think it's a really interesting field for research because it charts shifting.
Yeah, and Kathy's absolutely right. This comes from a larger project, and I'm trying to think of how can we account for the rise of optical media and sort of mass print and visual culture of the 19th century without reducing it to a techno-deterministic count. So I'm really interested in how culture is mediating these technical interventions as they occur, kind of flipping the narrative if I can prove it, as it were. So I'm thinking about, copy in the multiple sense, not in like, okay, I have a copy of, a famous, European painting that is still, a unique, even though it's a copy, it's still a painting, as opposed to, the same engraved image appearing multiple times, hundreds, if not thousands of times, through a variety of, largely print cultural habitats, as it were.
But you're going to be really well positioned to work through those questions in a larger project, because Chris's first book, for those of you who haven't read it, does start in the 1770s, 1780s, and moves through the 1820s. So you know that period. That's I think going to be one of the exciting things about the project as a whole, as it develops. There was a question here and then there.
Yeah, these are very rich papers, and we could ask questions all day. But I'm going to try one, and I wondered, Chris, if we could go back to your last image that had the engraving and a page of description of it. Is
Okay.
that hard to do? Otherwise, we can just imagine it.
I don't know.
You're not doing your own.
I'm not, yeah.
All right, well, we can just think.
We can
about it.
visualize it.
Okay, good. I was interested in something that Kathy remarked on, is that these texts kind of tell you how to look at the image. And they almost ask you to read it like a story. And they describe it not as we in our history class, or don't tell the story, start with what's the composition, but they don't. And they say, here's this guy in a room, and this guy, and you can tell exactly what kind of guy he is, and he's bursting in, and you can tell what the other one is doing, and it's very much storytelling. Yet at this time in the world of the fine arts, people, or a little earlier, people like Shaftesbury and Winkelmann are saying don't read art in a narrative way. But these people are telling you to enjoy the art in a very narrative way, almost as if it were, well, not an illustration to somebody else's story, but a story in itself.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
So in the discussion of how these things are set off as art and taken in a way that's different from text, in a way the text seems to be guiding you towards taking it in a way that's, I don't know, comparable to, analogous to text. And I wondered if the illustration from Ovid was seen the same way, or if perhaps all those nudes there could only be seen as this is art. So that's what I'd like you to think with, and how the idea of art being a story, or art being something that fights storytelling, might figure into your story.
Yeah, no, I have been thinking about that, and I confess I've been thinking about it from probably a overly literary approach. So I'm thinking about primarily Lessing's distinction, which was dominant about, really painting and poetry do sort of the same thing, and they both produce images, but they do so through different means. One is, spatial and all at once, and the other one, is sequential. And I found, in, not so much with this, but in other examples of textual illustrations where this approach is mediating it. The other factor, too, that's involved here is that often whoever the authors were, and we often don't know, we assume them mainly to be editors. Sometimes they had access to these images in advance, sometimes they did not. Sometimes they wrote them blind, as it were, matching what the descriptions were either from secondhand accounts or for whoever owned the original image or the engraving. So you find, the bus example isn't a particularly good, I think, instance of this, but there are plenty of others where you see, right, in the way that you're talking about, right, that they're generating a story almost imaginatively on their own, still performing what I would call the prior function of what literature in this relationship of producing images was, a kind of pictorialism, right? Not a sequence of images that builds up. A good example of this is a portrait of Amy Christon, which was in another gift book. So they have a classic kind of female portrait, and then there's a text accompanying the portrait. But the portrait itself, there's no particular, right, it doesn't bear any particular relationship to a narrative moment in that text. Instead, it becomes sort of a composite of so one of the frustrating things about trying to write about this relationship is that I find it changing all the time. I can't make any really, definitive statements about the relationship between image and text, particularly in the gift books, because there's just so many slippery conditions about, you go through the table, right, of contents and the embellishments, and these were being produced so hastily that the engravings don't match up at times to, I found errors in a lot of the indexes because the publishers are substituting whatever was at hand just to make sure they have their roughly 8 to 10 engravings, which is what all these subscribers wanted in the first place. So this gets to sort of that, right, matters and doesn't matter component about the relationship between text and images. But I'll certainly keep that in mind. Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Hi. I really enjoyed the papers very much, and I was thinking about this sort of positioning of visual and material culture in terms of, maybe a more straightforward formal analysis or social history. And for both of you, whether questions of formal analysis and social history kind of, derive from this work or dovetail with it at all. So for example, thinking about the bus image, and decoding it in a more traditional kind of art historical way, and in the social history piece, thinking about what it means for this English image of an election to sort of be seen by American audiences in a very particular moment. So I'm curious whether your project engages those questions at some moment, and then with the books that were produced for the blind, I was really thinking about those titles, and which titles were considered appropriate, because those weren't like common school textbooks, you know what I mean? They were very elite, sort of, at least what you showed. And so I was thinking about that social history of, what books are chosen. So I'm just curious for both of you in terms of positioning this type of really fascinating analysis, whether it dovetails with other modes of analysis as well.
Given time, I couldn't get into all, I had that one brief line about it was mostly biblical, moral works that predominated. And I should also say that there wasn't a lot of titles of books printed for the blind. So I think it was like a few hundred that were actually printed throughout the 19th century. And that kind of gets into sort of the materiality of the books, the production costs. And so maybe I'll use your question to sort of answer Kathy's question a little bit too. So, given, I don't know if it comes across in the screen shots that raised printing for the blind took up a lot more space than ink printing, regular ink printing on pages. So, a lot of times, like with the rudiments of natural philosophy, that full edition wasn't reissued in raised print for the blind. It was like half of that volume for natural, the history of natural philosophy. And a lot of times for like the moral works, like the Gospel of St. Mark, it's just the Gospel. The Bible was actually produced at the Perkins Institution in Boston Line. It was several volumes. So it's, if you have a book that's ink printed that's this big, once it gets into raised printing, it gets this big because you can't get as many letters on a page. You can't print on both sides. I should say Gospel of St. Mark, actually, which was the first one, 1833, that experiment, it was printed on both sides, but they were using plates, like copper plates that was deep engraved marks in them. And then later on, it started using actual type for the pages. So once it was getting to be with the type, you're not printing on both sides of the pages. So there's production costs that way. And actually, they're pretty light. The paper, if you hold a book of Printing for the Blind, it does not feel heavy. It's light. They also put like little stubs between the pages to keep at the edges of the paper to keep the embossment, so it didn't start to kind of to smush down. And a lot of the titles that were embossed, like I said, they were the popular immoral works. It was the Bible, the Gospels, and immoral works that that dealt with, like the Dairyman's Daughter was one where kind of getting past your physical disability, like moral uplift works. When initially Printing for the Blind was started, and thinking in terms of education, was very much kind of thinking of religious education and moral uplift, as opposed to just almost like kind of conflated with learning to read with your fingers. It was mostly the religious works, but there was like the history of natural philosophy, and then like some historical works like basic American history and basic primers, selected poetry that were some of the other titles. And I think one of the images I showed, actually at the Pennsylvania Institution for the Instruction of the Blind, they created the first American periodical for the blind. It was called the Students Magazine, and actually students made contributions to the magazine. It was their own writing. And then that lasted from about 1838 to 1843 was that periodical, and then there wasn't a periodical until the 1860s. There was a Napoleon V. Canese, who was a former pupil, and he was also he was former pupil, and he also was an instructor at the Pennsylvania Institution for the Instruction of the Blind. He started printing Niece's magazine, which was in race printing, and you can see he was taking excerpts from like Harper's Weekly and Harper's Leslie, so he was taking some so there was sort of popular magazine prints or excerpts were going into that magazine. So I think let's see what was kind of. Hopefully that's answering your question somewhat. I feel like I'm going a little farther afield, but I mean, works that seem to be popular with the sighted community were taken into, were thought about when they were printed for those who were blind. And when Braille started to ascend, that was also when the American Printing House for the Blind was federally funded, so in the 1870s. And so when there was a common reading system decided upon, or getting close to that for Braille, that's when sort of even more variety of titles started to be printed for the blind. I'm a little less familiar with all that, since I've been focused more on the mid 19th century. So hopefully that answers a bit your question.
It's a great question, and I've deliberately forestalled the hermeneutics of the image and the text. This is, we'll see if you can teach an old dog new tricks, but I wanted to not talk about the social history element or the formal elements, because I wanted the sort of medium specificity to arise and not stuff it into a history that we already know, and see what could be learned, if anything, from doing that. And that's been one of the most difficult things about trying to frame this project. And here the theorists that I have in mind that are behind it are Jacques Rancière on the one hand and Tom Mitchell on the other. And I'm trying to really not make the image, right, just this mute presence on the one hand, or right, the space for discourse, encoding a history on the other, and see what this operation of text and image together might allow for us to see, and also think about it really as much as someone who is not a media theorist or media studies person by trade, but allowing those methods to sort of see, okay, well, what do these do? What is their movement, right? Before I rush to the interpretive component of it, just to sort of, which isn't to say I haven't thought about them, and it's not important. The British and American reception histories of this image are wildly different, as you can imagine. They emphasize different things, particularly about how insolent, the commoner is being in the solicitation of a vote. The British and American have obviously different perspectives on this, but I wanted to hold that off in order to just sort of really get at how the engraving was circulating and before. And I think, I don't know, and I think that allowed me to kind of like see more about the actual, what Kathy was calling the material conditions of its production, to come forward a little bit more. And also maybe present an opportunity to articulate a different narrative for it.
Sir, in that.
Hi, quick question for both speakers. To Dr. Lukasik, that wonderful visual of the gentleman wearing the sandwich board saying, "Yes, I promised you artwork for Christmas, but I got drunk. I got messed up. Sorry." Is that actually a piece of work created by a guilty administrator or something that was commissioned by a very angry editor? Where did you find that?
It's a product of my imagination and Photoshop skills.
Really? Oh, that's son of a gun.
Yes.
You're not a man.
Yes.
That was splendid. Dr. Kelly, you raised Roman print texts. Were they effectively for people who had not been born blind, but whose sight got diminished and diminished and diminished? The equivalent of what we would consider a large text format in contemporary books, that people had learned to read, and at one point in their lives, their sight was of so little use that it was to be used in conjunction with magnifying lenses, their knowledge of reading, and this large type.
Yeah, actually when raised printing for the blind, when it was started up, it was presumed that it could be very, if you had low vision or if you were completely blind. I think what needs to be said is that statistically, it's a very small percentage of people who are born completely blind. So a lot of individuals, they could have had sight in their younger years and then went blind when they were older, or have been like a baby and lost their vision. And that's something I have thought about in looking at these materials. What is the difference if you are someone who is completely blind trying to read these letters with your fingers, but then if you do have some vision, and how that's affecting you. Yeah. No,
Because it presupposes some literacy.
Yeah. I mean, and I think because if you've seen a Roman letter at some point in your life, you might be able to, when you're tracing that with your finger, it's going to mean, resonate with you differently than someone who's never seen a Roman letter in their life, and what that means. There was actually a system which I did not show that was developed by someone named William Moon in the 1840s. He was English, and his system was specifically for people who went blind later in life. And so his was also considered an arbitrary system, where it was parts of letters, and it almost looks like hieroglyphics to some people. And that actually was a system that was still being used in England up until 2012. So it was sort of a main competitor to Braille. And actually it was popular in Philadelphia at the turn of the 20th century as well, even though Braille was starting to take over. But another thought that I've had too is that, just the reading conditions when you're reading the raised printing, if you're thinking about it, it's not this kind of lighting conditions necessarily. So, how is that affecting someone, sighted and maybe with low vision, reading these materials, via the eye and or fingertip, and I know that you asked about what people reception, there, and so far, I mean, I've not really found any kind of personal narratives about the actual experience of reading the raised alphabet. And a fair number of personal narratives were written by individuals who were blind during the 19th century, usually thought of as that was their job, and to raise money to support themselves, and kind of is glossed over a lot about reading and printing for the blind, or it's talked about there's not enough books that are in raised print for the blind. That quote I had by Levy, that is sort of as specific as it gets in some ways, is that, okay, the raised print, it's really, not, it's not a system that works for someone who reads by their finger. But it wasn't the Students magazine that was done by the Pennsylvania Institution of the Deaf and Blind. The students weren't talking about they were writing for the magazine, but not talking about what it was like to read that magazine. There was, in one of the annual reports for the Pennsylvania Institution, I think I do remember there was, they reprinted a letter where someone was saying, that she was so happy to finally have a magazine that, that she enjoyed reading it, but she didn't really specify if she was completely blind or if she had low vision. So, I mean, that's something else, I wish there was sort of more first-hand accounts of what it meant to read the raised alphabet, but I'm going to presume since, we're not, Braille prevailed, and when in the later 19th century, New York Point and Braille, which are both dot systems, there was something called the War of the Dots, where was the fight of like, would it be New York Point or would it be Braille would become the universal reading system, and Braille prevailed. And I'm going to assume, the dot systems and that those went out. That is, the best way to, that's the optimal way to read with your fingers, is not the raised alphabet.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Moving forward, yes.
I have a question for both speakers about negotiating taste boundaries, both your own and in the period. I'm very interested in, again, the selection of what books end up, having raised printing. And then also, I mean, I really do understand reading these 19th century texts that the discourse strikes the contemporary reader as humorous. I mean, I laugh out loud when I read some of this stuff. And also, about it being like a bad picture. So I guess I'm wondering for you as scholars, do you embrace that, your response, or do you try to suspend it? And then how do you think about, again, this is the reception question that's so difficult to get at, but maybe there's also a way to look at prescriptions about taste and how those affect these kinds of texts and how they might be understood or constructed.
I can start with that. Well, taste is at the heart of the gift book, the literary animal. But what's interesting, what I found in researching this genre, is that the typical accounts have it projecting outward. So, right, when this gets to the material, cultural aspects of it, the bindings and the embellishments, they would be given as gifts. The presentation plates are often missing in them now in the archives because they would be detached as sort of these as surrogates, whoever the gift giver was. And then they would be displayed either in a parlor or somewhere prominent place within the home. And so they clearly, because of the illustrations, were markers of some kind of refinement. And that's been well documented. But there also, I found an article from the 1850s that talked about the way in which the text, like in other words, the article was called "Put a Picture Up in Your Room," and it encouraged readers of gift books to detach the embellishments and hang them in the bedroom, which is a much more private space. And so there the relationship was less this like ostentation, but to think about, more in that didactic sense, about the community of readers constituted by the texts that were, often very sentimental in the gift book, and to reflect upon as you're looking at, the images would serve as occasions for this sort of, not, an outward display, but sort of an introspective, right, constitution of a different community and a different sense of, I guess, maybe in this case, moral refinement. As far as my own reaction to it, I don't think there's any way of getting around it. It's just, I try to confront it and get it out there. I think also when it's interesting, though, when I think about your question, made me think about how it reduplicates, though, in some ways, perhaps unintentionally, because there's a very gendered reception of particularly the text. The gift book genre was predominantly written and, a majority female authorship, and many women were consuming these. And the risk in the criticism or in the notices, you will see sort of, they're not laughing at it, but they're certainly degrading the literary quality of much of the sentimental literature that's being produced, and it's clearly across gender lines. So you have these male editors sort of, the common refrain is, the images are outstanding, right? But the literary, right, stuff is just pulpy, sentimental trash. And this is we have a long-standing history of talking about this in literary history, but it's interesting that I'm laughing more at the bust paintings, I guess, than I am necessarily. And the one the poem that Thompson wrote is written, he was just sort of a textual illustrator hack. He just churned out these poems for, that was sort of his thing, giving these sort of more or less audio transcripts, which I find very interesting. And this, I think, I was going to ask you about the acquisition of the literacy between the blind and the sighted being different by, an audio component and the pictorial component, right, when you have all those readers and stuff, as being maybe perhaps a difference to think about in that paper as well. But yes is the answer to both of those questions, and I haven't thought about how I want to tuck that into what I'm trying to describe here about the relationship between the two.
Oh, and I can say for me, I try not to put my 21st century values into interpreting how someone is reading the race print, and especially for me, I'm not someone with low vision or visually impaired, so I it's sort of a fine line I'm trying to walk as to how someone who cannot see is reading this material. But I think I'm thinking in terms of that, again, we've been a visually centric society for so long, 19th century, that that is affecting how someone who cannot see is interpreting the material. But I think there is something potentially that's universal over the ages with when you see something raised and embossed, that there is just this natural inclination that you do want to touch it. And I don't think that is necessarily putting my 21st century values onto the 19th century. So that's also something that has been not teased out as much with this paper, and I think about just really what it did mean for those who are sighted, their touch experience with that work. Again, it's not like you have a lot of archives, personal records of the educators who are teaching the blind, and how that, and even how that process worked. That's still kind of fuzzy, because I can imagine if you're teaching someone to, when they're learning to trace those letters and read that, I assume it's something like it's auditory, like, okay, that's an R, that's, like, it has to be sort of, when the sighted teachers are working with those who are blind to learn the urban alphabet, that there is an auditory element. And actually, I have thought about that even a little bit more in thinking in terms of expressive typography, which sort of is a little, kind of a complement to the font, psychology of font, that especially with the Philadelphia line, which is all capitals, you typically think of all capitals like someone shouting, being very loud, and I wonder if it's, someone is teaching someone to learn with these all capital Philadelphia lines, if it's, they're doing it very loudly, and it's just also partly like, this is very large type, and sort of almost, screaming this, or very, not screaming, but, to teach someone, it's, it's very expressive, and you are going to learn this with the capital letters. But something else I've also been thinking about with this.
I think it'd be fascinating too to situate what you're doing alongside, right, historical practices of literacy acquisition from the 19th century, and then also what we know now about, right, I'm thinking about cognitive neuroscience and sort of letter invariance and word superiority, where you can imagine, right, what happens with Braille is the transition to a digital, right, mode of transmission, which I don't know offhand, but I would assume the blind could read at a much faster rate, because we're limited to, we can only see, I think it's 10 to 12 letters per second movement. So, right, if you eliminate that from the process, right, of the communication circuit, you can go much more rapidly. And I was, I'm just curious as to whether they knew any of that with these instructors when they eventually developed Braille as a mode for instructing the blind.
Yeah, and it's something, this is kind of stepping a little bit back from what you were just saying, but also thinking of primers during the mid-19th century. I mean, very much, I think also think of like the storytelling aspect of illustrations, that individuals who could see were learning to read via stories. And sort of, how that's affecting if you are a sighted teacher, and that's how you learn to read, and how that's, affecting you as you're teaching someone who cannot, who's learning to read through the fingers, and what that kind of
right, because that's what they know, that the part of the brain which we read from is the same one that's visually related to object recognition, and it's evolved over time to like take on greater capacity. But that gets back to, right, those old picture books, with Z is for Zebu, and so forth, and they have, right, the letter, and then they have the image, and so you make that correlation, which is not possible, right? So, the sort of inherent deficiency or inefficiency of the system, just translating by analog, right, in the raised type.
Do we have
We should break.
Okay.